The fire started at the altar, and the doors had no keyhole. Welcome to Vale Files. I am your host, Thorn. Help this community grow. Drop a comment and say where you're listening from. I love seeing where our stories travel. Let's begin. It was on one of those leaden, smoky evenings in November that I found myself again at Baker Street, drawn not by a medical summons nor a social call, but by that ever-familiar tug of curiosity that Holmes, with his maddening brilliance and maddening silences, always seemed to awaken in me. The hearth in our sitting room was roaring, the scent of damp wool and pipe tobacco mingling in the air. Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair, fingers steepled, eyes half-closed. I had scarcely taken my seat when a loud knock rang from downstairs, followed by Mrs. Hudson's swift tread, and then a hesitant rap at our door. "Enter," Holmes called, his eyes still shut. The man who stepped in was soaked to the bone and clearly agitated. He was tall and scholarly in appearance, with prematurely white hair and a clerical collar at his throat. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice cracking with urgency, "I am Reverend Silas Beckett, vicar of St. Ethelric's Chapel. There has been a terrible incident, an outrage, truly. The chapel has been burned, and worse still, there is a body." Holmes opened his eyes and leaned forward. "A body?" "Yes, in the vestry," Reverend Beckett said, pulling a crumpled handkerchief from his pocket. "Charred beyond recognition, but we believe it to be my curate, young Matthew Ellicott. Scotland Yard is treating it as an unfortunate accident, an unattended lantern, they claim, but I am not so sure." "And what prompts your suspicion?" Holmes asked softly, rising to his feet. Reverend Beckett's eyes darted around the room as if expecting an unseen listener. "Because the fire began in the pulpit, not the vestry where the lanterns are kept, and because the chapel door was locked from the outside." There was a short silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. "Well, Watson," Holmes said, turning to me with a glint in his eye, "I believe our evening has just found its purpose." We arrived at St. Ethelric's in the dead of night. The air still reeked of scorched wood and incense. The small stone chapel stood like a blackened husk in the moonlight, its steeple half collapsed, the stained glass windows shattered into kaleidoscopic ruin. A lone constable dozed in a hansom nearby, while a horse snorted nervously in its harness. Lestrade, lantern in hand and coat collar turned up against the cold, met us at the scorched archway. "Holmes, Watson, I had a feeling you'd be sniffing around before dawn." "You wound me, Inspector," Holmes said cheerfully, "though from what I gather, the Yard considers this a case of tragic misfortune." "Open and shut," Lestrade replied. "Vestry lantern tips over, catches a cassock or some such. Poor chap's trapped, can't escape. Reverend Beckett says the door was locked from the outside, but any local lad could have bolted it by accident. Prank gone wrong." Holmes said nothing. He stepped lightly over the threshold, the ash crunching beneath his boots. Inside, the scene was grim. Blackened beams jutted from the ceiling like the ribs of a beast. The charred remains of pews stood like skeletal rows. But Holmes did not stop at the devastation. His attention was fixed entirely on the vestry door. "Burnt evenly," he murmured, running a gloved hand over the scorched wood. "But the lock, untouched. Watson, look here." I peered where he pointed. The padlock hung loosely on a rusted latch, entirely intact, not melted, not broken. "Not used," Holmes confirmed, standing. "This door was not locked during the fire. It was secured after the flames had done their work." Holmes straightened and turned sharply. "Lestrade, have your men made a thorough examination of the remains?" "Best as could be managed, given the state of them," Lestrade muttered. "We'll have dental confirmation soon, but the Reverend says it was Ellicott's shift to sleep in the chapel that night." Indeed, Holmes mused. But whether the victim chose to remain in the chapel is another matter altogether. As we rode back through fog-draped London, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. His brow was furrowed, his fingers twitching faintly with thought. At last, as we crossed over Westminster Bridge, he spoke. A fire that begins in the pulpit, a corpse locked in afterward, and a reverend who insists the simple explanation is too convenient. Curious, Watson? Curious indeed. You think it's murder? I think, Holmes said, turning his gaze out to the dark waters below, that it is something much worse. The following morning dawned grey and sullen, with a mist that curled through the narrow streets of Westminster like the fingers of something unseen. Holmes, having barely touched the coffee Mrs. Hudson brought him, sat at the breakfast table with the Times unopened, his gaze fixed instead on a charred piece of wood wrapped in brown paper. It had been discreetly passed to him by Lestrade at the scene, taken from beneath the pulpit. "There is a resin in this timber," he murmured, holding it beneath his nose, "not native to English oak. No ordinary chapel furnishing would contain it, at least not unless it had been tampered with. Do you smell it, Watson?" I leaned forward and inhaled cautiously. There was a faint but unmistakable scent, sweet, almost floral, yet undercut with a chemical sharpness that caught at the throat. "Something was added," Holmes continued, "to hasten the spread of the flames, a deliberate act, and a clever one. The fire appears accidental until one examines the wood." He stood abruptly and tossed aside the wrapping. "Come, Watson, we shall pay the good Reverend Beckett another visit. There is something about his concern I find precise." We arrived once again at St. Ethelrick's shortly past 9. The outer grounds were now cordoned off with rope, and constables patrolled the perimeter. A handful of locals stood behind the barrier, whispering and clutching shawls to their mouths as if the smoke still lingered in their lungs. Holmes ignored them entirely and strode through the gate with the certainty of a man walking into his own drawing-room. Reverend Beckett met us in what remained of the rectory study, a modest room whose bookshelves had been blackened by smoke, but had, mercifully, survived the worst of the blaze. He was seated at a desk, his hands clasped tightly together as though in prayer. When he looked up, the fatigue in his eyes was unmistakable. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you return quickly." "Time, Reverend, is an unkind master," Holmes said briskly, scanning the books along the wall. "You were fond of your curate, were you not?" "Matthew?" The vicar gave a thin smile. He was young, idealistic, devout, sometimes too much so. He came from nothing and threw himself into theology like a drowning man seizing a rope. I had hoped he might some day take over this parish. And had he any enemies? The Reverend hesitated. "None that I know of, though—" He paused. "There was a visitor last week, a woman. She came during evensong. I remember because Matthew seemed unusually unsettled afterward." "Describe her." "Unmarried, young. She wore a dark red coat, the sort more suited for the theatre than for chapel. She waited for him by the south transept, and they spoke in whispers. I did not pry, it is not my way, but I could see they had some prior acquaintance." "Did she give a name?" "Number. But she left in a hurry, and I confess, I caught a glimpse of her face. She looked afraid." Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming. "There is always a woman," he muttered. Then to the Reverend, "You would not by chance have a list of your parishioners? Or the donation ledgers?" Beckett gestured toward a scorched metal box on the sideboard. "What wasn't lost to the fire is in there, but I warn you it is incomplete." Holmes took the box, offered a slight bow, and turned to leave. As we stepped back into the ash-laden street, I could no longer keep silent. "Holmes, you suspect that Ellicott was murdered? By arson?" "Not murdered, Watson. Silenced." He gestured toward the fog as if drawing aside a curtain. "Someone wanted him removed, yes. But fire is not the weapon of a passionate killer. It is the tool of one who desires destruction and concealment. What did Ellicott know? Whom did he meet? And most of all, why would he not speak of it?" We returned to Baker Street, and Holmes at once plunged into the box of salvaged records, spreading the soot-smudged pages across our table. Donation entries, dates, initials. Nothing leapt out at me, but Holmes seemed to see patterns I could not. "Note this, Watson. On the second Sunday of each month, a recurring anonymous donation appears. £5, always in cash, always unsigned. Unusual? Unusual for such a modest parish, more so because it ceases abruptly last week." "The week of the fire?" "Precisely." He leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head. "Ellicott may have been many things, but he was not a fool. He knew something, and I believe he tried to confront someone about it, someone who wished to keep him very quiet indeed." Before I could respond, a knock interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with a card on a silver tray. "It's a young lady, Mr. Holmes. Wouldn't give her name, only said it was regarding the chapel." Holmes arched an eyebrow and sprang to his feet. "Show her in." The woman who entered was pale, finely dressed, and wore the unmistakable air of someone attempting courage, but close to despair. She looked no older than 23, with delicate gloves and eyes rimmed in red. "You're Mr. Holmes," she said softly. "And this is Dr. Watson. You are correct. Please sit. You've come about Matthew Ellicott." Her eyes widened, then welled with tears. Yes, I was engaged to him, secretly." "Why secretly?" "My family would never have approved. My father is Colonel Harold Entwistle, retired. We live in Hampstead. He would never allow a clergyman's son with no prospects to court me. But Matthew, he loved me." "And you met him last week?" She nodded. "At the chapel." He seemed frightened. "He told me he had discovered something, that someone in the parish, someone prominent, was using the church for illegal purposes. He wouldn't say what, only that he had to put it right." "Did he name anyone?" "Number he said he had proof, and that once he confronted them, he would go to the authorities." I begged him to wait, but he was stubborn, even when scared. Holmes leaned forward, his voice gentle but precise. "Did he mention the donations? A ledger?" "Yes, he said he had hidden a page from it, one that had been altered." "Do you know where?" She hesitated. "He only said, not far from God's ear." I didn't understand. Holmes sat back, the phrase echoing in the silent room. Then he smiled, not with joy, but with anticipation. "Watson, we must return to the chapel immediately. I believe our Mr. Ellicott left us one final sermon." The girl looked bewildered, but Holmes was already collecting his coat. "Miss Entwistle, you've done a brave thing in coming here. Go home now. Stay safe. We shall uncover the truth." As we rode once again through the thickening fog, Holmes stared out the window, his brow furrowed. Not far from God's ear. Watson, the pulpit, or more precisely, behind it. I suspect Ellicott hid the damning evidence in the one place his killer thought had been destroyed by fire. But if it survived... He said no more, but his fingers drummed ceaselessly on the window pane as the hansom clattered on, the spire of the ruined chapel rising like a black finger from the fog. We arrived at St. Ethelric's just past 3 o'clock, the pallid winter sun doing little to pierce the thickening gloom that hung low over the chapel's charred ruins. A constable recognized Holmes at once and, with a respectful nod, allowed us entry without challenge. The main door groaned as it opened, revealing the skeletal interior, where blackened beams cast long, mournful shadows across the cold stone floor. Holmes walked with deliberate purpose, scanning the nave with a practiced eye. Ash crunched beneath our feet, and the scent of burnt wood still lingered, mingled now with the faint odour of damp stone. He paused at the pulpit, what remained of it, a structure scorched but not entirely collapsed. The carved wooden canopy above it, once an ornate testament to ecclesiastical craftsmanship, now hung crooked, blackened at the edges but still recognizable. "Not far from God's ear," Holmes repeated quietly. "A clever man, Ellicott." With unexpected agility, he hoisted himself up into the pulpit, crouching within the confined space. I stood at the foot, peering upward, as Holmes ran his hands along the underside of the canopy and the small lectern. After several moments, he tapped twice against the wooden base, first softly, then with more force. "Hollow," he muttered. "Watson, be so good as to pass me my penknife." I reached into his coat pocket and handed it up. He inserted the blade into the seam between two panels, pried gently, and with a low creak, a segment of the pulpit's base gave way. From within, wrapped in oilcloth and lightly dusted with soot, he withdrew a folded piece of paper. Even before he opened it, I saw the telltale smudges of ink and scorched edges. "Ledger paper," Holmes said, jumping lightly down and opening it on a stone bench. "One of the missing pages, no doubt. And look, entries scratched out, amounts changed, initials that do not match the master book. Here is our motive." He pointed to a line dated 4 weeks prior. £200, anonymously donated but in a hand that differs subtly from the others. And below it, revised in another ink, £50. The remaining sum, gone. Pocketed. I frowned. "Embezzlement?" "At first glance, yes, but look here." He pointed to a note, scribbled faintly in the margin, just visible through the grime. "C to receive final share after Friday vestry, and that date matches the night of the fire." "C?" I asked. "An initial?" "Unlikely a coincidence," Holmes murmured. "Someone was to be paid, but Ellicott intercepted the transaction, or tried to, and paid for it with his life." We returned to Baker Street at dusk. Holmes said little during the ride, save to murmur once, "The list of the Reverend's associates grows shorter, Watson." Back in the sitting room, he paced with mounting energy, the page now sealed in an envelope and placed atop the mantel. "We must learn who this C is," he said, spinning on his heel. "And there is only one person left who might know more than she has told us." "You mean Miss Entwistle?" "No," Holmes replied. "I mean Reverend Beckett." Before I could question him further, Holmes was already drafting a note and summoning a boy from the street to deliver it. The message was an invitation, politely worded but unmistakably firm, for Reverend Beckett to visit Baker Street at his earliest convenience. The earliest, as it turned out, was within the hour. The vicar arrived wrapped in a thick overcoat, his eyes hollow with fatigue, though he greeted us with the courtesy of a man still clinging to his composure. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I received your summons." "Thank you for coming," Holmes said, gesturing to a chair. "Would you care for brandy? No? Then let us proceed plainly." He retrieved the envelope from the mantel and withdrew the ledger page, placing it on the table between them. "Do you recognize this?" Beckett stiffened. "That looks like one of our collection sheets, though I can't be certain. The fire." "Indeed," Holmes said smoothly. "This page, Reverend, was hidden in the pulpit, not destroyed by fire. And as you can see, the handwriting tells a tale most troubling." Beckett leaned in, his brow furrowed. "I don't understand." "Come now, Reverend," Holmes said, his voice quiet but firm. "You've served this parish long enough to recognize the hand of your treasurer." These figures were altered. funds redirected, names concealed. And according to a note at the margin, someone identified only as C was to receive a final sum on the very night Ellicott died. Beckett's fingers clenched around the edge of the table. "You believe I'm involved?" Holmes studied him. "I believe you knew something, perhaps not the full scheme, but enough to make you wary." The vicar's lips trembled. "I suspected mismanagement, some oddities in the books, yes, but when I asked questions I was told it was a mistake, rounding errors, transposed figures. Our treasurer, Mr. Crowthorne, assured me it would be corrected." "Crowthorne?" Holmes echoed, eyes narrowing. "A man who rarely appeared in your ledgers except as an accountant? Was he present on the night of the fire?" Beckett hesitated. No, he wasn't. He told me his mother had fallen ill in Croydon." Holmes turned to me with a grim smile. "A convenient illness. Watson, fetch me the postal directory." I complied, and Holmes flipped swiftly through the names until he found what he sought. "Mr. Edwin Crowthorne resides in Notting Hill, treasurer of St. Ethelrick's for the past 2 years, a man with access to funds and no oversight save a distracted vicar." Beckett's face had grown pale. "Mr. Holmes," he whispered, "if Crowthorne truly killed Matthew, he set the fire, yes, perhaps intending only to destroy the evidence. But Ellicott was there, perhaps to confront him, perhaps by chance. Either way, Crowthorne ensured he would not leave." Holmes snapped the ledger shut, and now, with the evidence retrieved, he may be planning his departure. He turned to me, eyes alight with purpose. "Watson, fetch your coat. We go to Notting Hill. If we are fortunate, Mr. Crowthorne has not yet slipped through the cracks." It was fully dark by the time we arrived at the address, a modest house with a narrow garden gate and no light showing in the front windows. Holmes examined the door, then rapped twice with his cane. No response. He tried again, louder, still silence. Then a noise, a soft creak from within. Holmes placed a finger to his lips and we stepped back from the door just as it opened a sliver. A pale face peered out, and in that instant, Holmes lunged. The door swung wide as Holmes grabbed the man by the collar and pulled him into the hall. "Edwin Crowthorne, I presume?" Holmes said coolly. "We were just discussing your disappearance." Crowthorne stammered, struggling feebly. I don't know what." Holmes silenced him with a gesture. "Save your protestations for Inspector Lestrade. I believe he'll be eager to discuss arson and murder." As I shut the door behind us and fetched the constable standing watch at the corner, Holmes held our captive fast. The case had opened with fire and shadow, but now a shape was beginning to emerge through the smoke. The constable arrived swiftly at Holmes's signal, and with only minimal resistance, Edwin Crowthorne was escorted from his modest house and placed under temporary custody on Holmes's authority. The official charge deferred until Scotland Yard could be properly summoned. Holmes watched his removal with quiet satisfaction, then turned back to me. "He will not speak easily," he murmured. "Men like Crowthorne, bookkeepers by temperament and cowards by nature, do not resort to fire and murder unless driven by desperation. He is afraid of something greater than prison." "Or someone?" I suggested, pulling my coat tighter against the biting night. "Precisely. That is the thread yet dangling, Watson. He is no mastermind, merely a man who kept accounts and found himself in too deep." The next morning brought Inspector Lestrade to Baker Street in a foul temper and with a face that looked like it had been pressed against a blackboard for several hours. He dropped his bowler hat on the table and sat heavily in the armchair opposite Holmes, who had resumed his usual sprawl by the fire. "You've made quite the mess, Holmes," he said gruffly. "Dragged a man out of his home, accused him of arson and murder. He's denying everything, of course." "Naturally," Holmes said. That's why I have brought you a witness and a document. The ledger page confirms financial irregularities leading directly to Crowthorne, and Miss Entwistle is willing to testify that Ellicott feared for his life on the very night the chapel was set ablaze. Lestrade leaned forward and rubbed his forehead. Even so, motives still murky. Money alone rarely drives a man to murder in so dramatic a fashion, and there's no direct evidence placing him at the scene. Holmes smiled slightly. "Yeah, but I wager Crowthorne's alibi will not survive close scrutiny. His mother, I suspect, has been dead these 3 years. We shall have confirmation before nightfall, and as to motive, well, we must dig deeper." The ledger contains initials, vague references, and one particularly intriguing note: C to receive final share. That implies partners, Lestrade. Multiple beneficiaries. Lestrade grunted, but he did not argue. "You have leave to search his house?" Holmes asked. "We've just begun. Nothing substantial yet. A few bank drafts, some church papers." "All in order?" "Of course they are," Holmes said, rising. "No embezzler hides evidence where it is expected. Come, Watson, let us visit Crowthorne's place of work. The treasurer may hide nothing at home, but his desk at the parish office may tell us far more." The offices of St. Ethelric's were housed in a modest stone annex adjacent to the rectory, mostly undamaged by the fire. A clerk let us in with some hesitation, but Holmes quickly produced a note from Lestrade authorizing access. We were directed to a small room lined with filing cabinets and shelves of hymnals, the desk at the far end covered in dust and unopened letters. Holmes began to search methodically, opening drawers with swift, practiced movements. I occupied myself scanning the shelves, finding nothing of particular interest until Holmes let out a short, satisfied sound. He held up a small envelope hidden beneath the false bottom of the central drawer. It was unsealed and contained a folded sheet of thick paper, an invoice from a company I did not recognize, Callard and Smythe, Architectural Restoration and Construction. "Repairs?" I asked. Holmes nodded slowly. "On paper, but look, this is dated 6 weeks prior, and the work supposedly done pertains to the pulpit and support beams. Curious timing, considering the origin of the fire." He flipped the invoice over, revealing a scribbled note in pencil. "Balance paid privately. C." We stared at each other. "Why falsify a construction invoice?" I said. Unless the work was never done," Holmes finished. "Or worse, done not for restoration, but sabotage. We must speak to the firm at once." We hired a cab and drove through the morning fog to Clerkenwell, where Callard and Smythe maintained a discreet office front. The foreman, a short, leathery man with a suspicious squint, welcomed Holmes coolly once he saw the card. "No, sir, we don't do church restorations often," he said, scratching his ear. "Only small jobs. We done some roof patching for St. Ethelric's a year ago, but naught since, certainly not pulpit beams." Holmes showed him the invoice. "Is this your firm's paper?" The man frowned and took the page. "It's our letterhead, but this isn't our work, nor my writing. Forgery, this is." "Would you be willing to attest to that in writing?" The foreman nodded. "Gladly. Fraud on our name's no small matter." Back outside, Holmes's expression was grim. The circle tightens. The invoice was a cover, money funneled to someone under pretense of repairs. We now have motive, Watson: embezzlement, fraud, destruction of evidence, and perhaps blackmail. Crowthorne may have feared being exposed himself, or he was paid to stay silent. Either way, the fire was meant to burn more than wood. We returned to Baker Street to find Lestrade waiting, looking agitated. "Well?" Holmes asked. We spoke to Crowthorne again, pressed him with the construction invoice and ledger. He cracked. Half cracked, anyway. Said he wasn't the one who set the fire, Says someone forced him to keep the books, funnel money, even forge invoices, said he was terrified, begged us to protect him. Did he name names? Only one. Lestrade hesitated, said he was told to refer to his superior only as the Bell. Holmes's eyes flashed. The Bell? Lestrade nodded. Odd name for a man, but Crowthorne swears it. Never saw the face. Said instructions were left in notes typed, no handwriting. Payments were collected by runners. Holmes strode to the window and looked out over Baker Street deep in thought. Then our true adversary remains in shadow. We've exposed the embezzlement, the arsonist and the cover-up, but the orchestrator still pulls strings. Any idea who it is? Lestrade asked. I have a suspicion, Holmes said slowly. One final piece remains, Watson. Do you recall Reverend Beckett's demeanour, his calmness in the face of tragedy? Yes. Remarkably composed. Almost too composed, Holmes murmured. Consider the peculiarities. A reverend aware of unusual donations. A reverend who recalls a frightened woman speaking to Ellicott. And yet, no action taken, only regret after the death. You think Beckett is the Bell? Not yet, but I intend to find out. Holmes turned back to Lestrade. Let Crowthorne sit for now. He's safest in your cells, and keep this quiet. Our adversary is methodical. If he suspects discovery, he may flee or act again. As the inspector left, Holmes returned to his violin, drawing slow, contemplative notes that wavered like the fog outside. I knew the sound well. It meant his mind was racing, the music a tether to thought. I waited. Then finally he said, Tomorrow morning, Watson, we return to the chapel, not to find what was hidden, but to observe what remains. Our answer may lie not in ashes, but in what the fire could not destroy. And so the music played on, winding through the smoky air as the mystery of the burning chapel crept ever closer to its revelation. The following morning brought with it a fine drizzle that hung in the air like a curtain of mist, muting the sounds of the city and lending a peculiar hush to the streets. We breakfasted quickly, Holmes silent throughout save for a cryptic remark about what remains in sacred stone long after fire forgets its name. I had learned long ago not to press him when he entered such states. His mind, I knew, was spiralling towards some hidden conclusion. By mid-morning, we were again at St. Ethelric's, the skeletal chapel rising before us like a monument to grief. A constable stood watch by the entrance, now familiar with our presence and respectfully inclined to look the other way. Holmes strode into the nave without hesitation, the charred timbers above casting a fractured lattice of shadow across the floor. The question, he murmured, scanning the blackened space, is not merely what was burnt, but what was spared. I followed him past the pews, where the scent of soot still clung to every surface, until we arrived once more at the pulpit. Holmes stood before it in silence, his head tilted slightly, as if listening. Then he turned and walked purposefully toward the rear alcove, where a modest brass bell, untouched by the fire, hung from a beam. It had once signalled the start of services, now it swung listlessly in the damp air. He reached up and rang it gently. The sound, soft but clear, echoed mournfully through the empty chapel. "The bell, Watson," he said, eyes fixed on the mechanism above. "It is both a name and a location." I stepped closer. "I don't follow." "Consider," Holmes said, tapping the beam above us, "that Ellicott may have left behind more than one message. He hinted at God's ear, which led us to the pulpit. But what is a bell if not the voice of the chapel? And if one wished to send a final warning quietly, yet unmistakably, what better symbol to choose?" Holmes produced a small, folding ladder that had been propped near the vestry entrance and brought it to the base of the bell tower. With remarkable agility, he climbed up toward the belfry, where the mechanism and housing resided. I remained below, uneasy at the sight of him vanishing into the upper gloom. A few minutes passed, and then I heard the scrape of metal and a sharp intake of breath. "Watson!" he called down. "Come and see." I ascended the ladder carefully, and as I reached the final rung, Holmes helped guide me into the cramped belfry. The air was close, tinged with mildew and rust, but Holmes pointed to a narrow compartment beneath the bell's mount, a maintenance panel. Inside, cushioned beneath a fold of cloth, sat a small envelope and a glass vial half filled with a viscous amber liquid. He held up the note, addressed to Miss Entwistle. The envelope bore no stamp, but her name was written in a steady, familiar hand. Holmes slit it open delicately and unfolded the contents. "My dearest," he read aloud, "if anything should happen to me, know that I tried to do what was right. I have discovered something terrible, something involving the very soul of the Church. I do not yet understand its full scope, but I believe the funds were being used for more than personal gain. I fear someone is moving sacred space for profane purpose. The man behind it all is called the Bell, but I cannot yet see his face. If you receive this, go to Mr. Holmes. He is the only one who may understand. Yours always, Matthew." Holmes held the vial up to the grey light filtering through the belfry slats. "This, Watson," he said quietly, "is phosphorus." I blinked. "An accelerant?" "A highly unstable one, rarely used in arson because of its volatility, but highly effective if one wishes to ensure complete combustion. Ellicott must have retrieved this, perhaps intending to expose it or perhaps to prove the fire was no accident. Instead, he hid it, along with his final words, here in the bell tower." We descended without speaking, the weight of the discovery settling over us. Outside the chapel, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the bare bones of the neighborhood beyond. Children played in the street. A milk cart clattered past. Life continued, as if nothing had happened. Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid the letter and the vial on the table and stood in contemplation. "The pattern sharpens," he said. "Crowthorne was merely a steward. The real architect used him to channel funds, first through fictitious invoices, then through staged repairs. But Ellicott discovered something deeper. He spoke of profane purposes. That is no ordinary language, Watson. That is the language of a man who has glimpsed something corrupt at the core of sanctity. You believe it goes beyond embezzlement? Far beyond." He turned, and his gaze was intense. "Think of it. What if the funds were not merely stolen but redirected? What if the chapel itself was being repurposed for something clandestine? A meeting place, a hiding spot, something worth destroying rather than being exposed." At that moment, a knock came at the door, brisk and urgent. Holmes opened it to reveal Miss Entwistle, pale and breathless. "I received your message, Mr. Holmes," she said. "You said there was a letter?" Holmes offered her the envelope with great gentleness. She read in silence, her hands trembling. A tear slipped down her cheek. "I knew he was frightened," she whispered. "But this—" "Your fiancé was brave," Holmes said, "and his final act may yet bring justice." She looked up, her eyes steady now. "Then let me help." Holmes nodded. "Tell me, Miss Entwistle, did Ellicott ever mention any unusual visitors to the chapel, apart from yourself?" She thought for a moment. "There was one man, distinguished-looking. He came during the afternoons, sometimes after vespers. I saw him leave once, tall in a brown coat, with a silver-headed cane. Matthew said he was from the diocese, but I never believed it." Holmes's expression changed instantly. He crossed the room to a cabinet, withdrew a thin folder, and opened it to a page containing a newspaper clipping and a small photograph. Was this the man? She studied it and nodded. Yes, that's him. I stepped forward. Who is it? Holmes's voice was cold and certain. Archdeacon Sylvanus Grey, once implicated in a scandal involving misappropriated charity funds in Surrey, quietly dismissed but never prosecuted. I had wondered if he'd re-emerged under a different guise. Then he's the Bell? I asked. Most likely, Holmes said. A man of the cloth with connections, access, and plausible deniability. He would have used Crowthorne to shift funds discreetly, stage restorations, perhaps even convert the chapel into something other than a place of worship. And when Ellicott began asking questions, he let the thought trail off. We must find him, I said. Warn Lestrade. Holmes was already moving. We shall do more than warn, we shall intercept. Archdeacon Grey attends the monthly vestry meetings at St. Martin's in the Fields, this afternoon as it happens. If he feels the noose tightening, he may flee. But if we're there... We left at once, Miss Entwistle remaining behind with Mrs. Hudson, her face a mask of resolve. As our cab sped through the winding London streets, Holmes leaned back, his fingers tapping lightly against the seat. It ends today, Watson. In fire it began, and in truth it shall end. The cab rolled to a halt at the eastern entrance of St. Martin's in the Fields, just as the bell in the tower struck 2. The cold had sharpened since morning, and the square outside was brisk with movement. Vendors packing up carts, horse-drawn cabs rattling down Charing Cross Road, and a few stragglers ducking beneath the portico of the church to avoid the drizzle that had begun anew. Holmes stepped out without hesitation, his eyes scanning every face with clinical precision. I followed close behind, my own senses alert. Inside, the nave was nearly empty, its vaulted ceiling echoing with the subdued rustling of cassocks and murmured exchanges. A verger directed us quietly to the meeting chamber, a modest room at the rear, where the vestry committee of the parish held its monthly affairs. As we approached, we could already hear voices within, measured, ecclesiastical tones, a note of administrative tedium overlaid with forced cordiality. Holmes paused at the door, his hand on the latch, then turned to me. "Watch his eyes, Watson," he said. "A guilty man hears his name the way a hunted stag hears the snap of a twig." He opened the door smoothly and stepped inside. 7 men sat around a long oak table, clerical collars prominent among them. A faint haze of pipe smoke hung above their heads. The chatter ceased instantly as Holmes entered. "Gentlemen," he said with quiet authority, "forgive the interruption. I am Sherlock Holmes. I believe one of you is a murderer." There was a sharp rustle, papers shifted, chairs scraped, but no one spoke. Holmes walked slowly around the table, his gaze moving from one face to the next. "Among you is a man who has embezzled funds from the church, who has misused the sanctity of a sacred building for clandestine ends, and who orchestrated a fire to destroy the evidence of his betrayal, killing a young curate in the process." Still silence. Then Holmes stopped behind a tall, silver-haired man seated at the far end. "Archdeacon Grey," Holmes said coolly, "perhaps you would care to explain your connection to St. Ethelrick's." The man rose slowly. His face was calm, too calm, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the rich timbre of clerical practice. "I have advised numerous chapels over the years, Mr. Holmes, including, yes, St. Ethelrick's. I was asked to consult on matters of disrepair." Holmes stepped closer. "And did that consultation include forging invoices, arranging private payments through a proxy, and supplying volatile chemicals under the guise of restoration?" Grey's expression did not change, but I saw the muscles along his jaw tighten. "You speak in riddles," he said. and with no official warrant I must ask you to leave." Holmes nodded slowly. "Very well. Let us make it official." He turned to the open doorway where Lestrade now stood, flanked by two uniformed officers. The inspector looked grim and resolute. "Archdeacon Sylvanus Grey," Lestrade said, stepping into the room, "you are under investigation for fraud, conspiracy to commit arson, and accessory to murder. We'll be asking you to come with us." Grey did not move. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table. He looked not at Lestrade, but at Holmes. "You have nothing," he said softly. Holmes's response was equally quiet. "We have the ledger, the forged invoice, a witness who saw you leaving the chapel, and the testimony of your accomplice. We also have a letter from the deceased, a final confession hidden in the bell tower you never thought to search. Your silence is the last piece, Grey." Still the Archdeacon did not resist. With quiet dignity, he allowed himself to be escorted from the room. As he passed Holmes, he paused only once. "You're clever, Mr. Holmes, but cleverness without faith is a dangerous thing." Holmes met his gaze without blinking. "Faith without conscience is worse." The door shut behind them. In the quiet that followed, the remaining members of the vestry committee looked around uneasily. No one spoke. Eventually Holmes turned to me. "The spider has been drawn from the web," he said, "but the damage will linger." Outside, the rain had grown heavier. We stepped beneath the church's portico and stood watching as the officers helped Grey into a waiting police cab. "He was calm," I said, "almost resigned." "He's a man used to authority," Holmes replied. "He believed himself untouchable, and for a time he was." We rode back in silence, each lost in thought. Back at Baker Street, Holmes removed his coat and sat once again in his chair. The fire was low, but he did not rise to stoke it. Instead, he reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out the vial of phosphorus. He held it to the light, watching the faint shimmer of its contents. "That," he said quietly, "was meant to erase truth. But truth, like fire, spreads when touched to dry wood. Ellicott gave us the spark. We merely followed the smoke." I nodded, then leaned back in my chair. "There's something I don't understand," I said after a moment. "Why now? Why destroy the chapel at this particular moment? If Grey had been embezzling funds for months, why burn it all down just then?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Because he was about to be exposed. Ellicott had uncovered too much. Crowthorne had grown frightened, and perhaps Grey knew that hesitation in one man could undo the silence of many. Better to sacrifice the whole chapel than risk its walls speaking." He paused. "And perhaps, too, he hoped to shift the blame onto Crowthorne, eliminate the risk, contain the breach." I glanced at the hearth. "A cold, calculated mind." "Yes," Holmes said. "But even the most calculating minds leave cracks. It is not the flamboyant villain who fails. It is the one who believes no one is looking." That evening, as darkness fell and the last of the fog rolled away from the rooftops, Miss Entwistle returned to Baker Street. Her eyes were clear now, her voice steady. Holmes gave her the letter, Matthew's final message, and said nothing more. She stood before the fire for some time, silent, then said quietly, "Thank you. I feared his death would mean nothing, that it would vanish like smoke." Holmes rose. "Miss Entwistle, the world often forgets the brave, but the brave do not act for the world. They act because it is right." She gave a slight, grateful nod and took her leave. Long after she had gone, Holmes stood by the window, looking down at the street as the gas lamps flickered to life. I joined him. "Will the church try to bury the scandal?" "Perhaps," he said. "But too many eyes have seen now, And too many voices, Watson will remember what was nearly silenced. The case was over. But in the heart of Baker Street, the echo of the burning chapel lingered, its final toll not one of bells, but of truth rising from ash. Though the central figure had been apprehended and the machinery of justice set in motion, Holmes was not yet satisfied. I recognized the signs at once. His silences lengthened, his pipe never quite left his hand, and his violin, so often his companion in closure, remained untouched in its case. On the third morning after Archdeacon Gray's arrest, I found him standing at the window in a dressing gown, gazing out at the awakening city with that peculiar stillness which always indicated a mind moving swiftly beneath a tranquil surface. "There is a second layer," he murmured, almost to himself. "Something that has not yet revealed itself." I set down the breakfast tray, already cold from neglect, and crossed the room. "I thought the matter closed," I said cautiously. "Gray's scheme has been uncovered, the ledger traced, Crowthorne confessed, and Miss Entwistle's testimony, together with Ellicott's letter, will ensure conviction." Holmes did not turn. "Yes. But does it strike you as curious, Watson, that a man as cunning as Gray, a man who covered his tracks so thoroughly, used proxies, avoided handwriting, staged fires, would risk being seen at all, that he would attend the chapel himself, not once but several times? Perhaps necessity, or overconfidence. Possibly. But men like Gray do not expose themselves unless forced to, and therein lies the puzzle." He turned abruptly from the window and crossed to his desk, drawing out the forged invoice once more. It was the same sheet we had retrieved from Crowthorne's false-bottom drawer, now crinkled at the corners from repeated handling. "Read it again, Watson, not for numbers, but for implication." I complied, scanning the familiar type. "Restoration of pulpit housing and support beams. Discretion required. Payment to be collected in person. Balance by private arrangement." Holmes tapped the final line. That phrase always struck me as odd. Discretion required. Who inserts such a note on a false invoice unless it mirrors a real instruction? He strode to the bookcase, retrieving a slim volume of diocesan regulations. Consider this. What if Gray wasn't embezzling solely for personal gain? What if the funds and the structural alterations were not only about skimming money, but accommodating someone? I blinked. "Are you suggesting the chapel was being used by a third party?"
"Exactly," Holmes said, eyes flashing. "Gray was intelligent, yes, but not omniscient. The phosphorus, the bell tower letter, the fire, they speak to a larger urgency. He was desperate, not merely cautious. I believe someone higher than Gray, or at least more dangerous to him, had begun using the chapel for purposes he couldn't control." I sat, stunned by the notion. "But what purpose?" Holmes resumed pacing. "That is the question, and to answer it, we must follow the money, not just where it ended, but where it originated." By mid-afternoon, we found ourselves at the offices of Bartholomew Rivington and Sons, the diocesan bankers. Holmes, ever the master of official pretext, had prepared a forged letter of introduction from the bishop's secretary. It gained us access to the ledgers without resistance. The head clerk, a humorless man with ink-stained fingers, escorted us to a quiet alcove where the volumes were housed. Holmes examined them with the diligence of a surgeon, page after page, until he gave a soft exclamation. "Here," he said, sliding a thick register across the table. "A donation, £500, from a source marked only as Northern Mission Society. Delivered 6 months ago. Immediately transferred to St. Ethelric's, bypassing standard approval." The clerk blinked. "That's most irregular. Northern Mission Society. I don't believe they're part of the Church of England proper." "Nor are they," Holmes said with grim satisfaction, "which is why their presence in these books is so troubling." We returned to Baker Street in silence. Only when the door closed behind us did Holmes speak again. It is clear now, he said. Gray allowed the chapel to become a shell, used by an outside group for undisclosed activity. He provided cover, access, and laundering. But at some point, Ellicott grew suspicious. He saw things, heard things, and Gray's partner, the true benefactor, realized exposure was imminent. He paused at the hearth, where the fire had burned low. I suspect Gray intended only to erase records, to frighten Ellicott perhaps, but someone else, someone higher, demanded the fire. I felt a cold tingle. You mean Gray was not the one who killed Ellicott? Holmes turned to me, his eyes hard. He enabled it, but I believe he no longer controlled the outcome. A knock interrupted us, swift, agitated. Mrs. Hudson opened the door to reveal Inspector Lestrade, his face pale, lips drawn tight. You'd best come, he said, without preamble. Gray's dead. The three of us stood over the body in the Newgate infirmary an hour later. Gray lay on the cot, his head turned slightly to the side. His face was peaceful, unnaturally so. Cyanide, the prison doctor muttered. Hidden in a ring, must have bitten down on it this morning during morning prayers. Holmes said nothing for a long time. Then he
turned to Lestrade. Who visited him yesterday? Just his solicitor, and a church official, claimed to be from the Office of Episcopal Affairs. Name? Reverend Amos Pritchard. Holmes's lips compressed. There is no Reverend Amos Pritchard in the Episcopal Office. I checked last week. Lestrade cursed under his breath. You think he was silenced? I don't think it, Lestrade. I know it. We left the prison with the cold wind at our backs, both of us wrapped in silence. Only once we were seated in the cab again did Holmes speak. There is still another figure, Watson, hidden, watching, manipulating. Gray was their front, but now that he's gone, they may attempt to vanish again. Do you have any idea who it is? Holmes nodded slowly. Not a name, not yet. But we know their method. They use the church as a mask. They communicate through proxies. And they are willing to kill. He turned to me, his voice grave. We must go deeper. Ellicott's death was not the end of a mystery. It was the edge of a much darker design. The following day was one of slate-coloured skies and sullen streets, the kind of day that seemed to press heavily upon London's rooftops and drain the warmth from every stone. Holmes was up early, already dressed and brooding over a map of parish boundaries and ecclesiastical jurisdictions, when I emerged from my room. His coffee sat untouched, cooling in the thin morning light. Gray's death, he said without turning, was meant to close the book. But in doing so, it has revealed the hand that held the pen. I crossed to the table. The map spread before him was marked with faint pencil strokes, radiating outward from St. Ethelrick's in spokes that reached through the city like spider legs. This is the ecclesiastical network, Holmes continued, every minor chapel, mission house, and relief outpost that reported through St. Ethelrick's over the past 2 years. It was the perfect node, unremarkable, modest, tucked away near the edge of 2 parishes. But when viewed in relation to the network... He paused, tapping one of the outermost circles. It becomes a crossroads. I bent lower. That's St. Dunstan's mission in Shoreditch. And this, he said, indicating another, is a soup kitchen attached to All Saints near the river, listed as under discreet support by the same financial intermediary we saw in the St. Ethelrick's ledger. He stepped back. 3 institutions, none prominent on their own, but all recipients of funding from the same fictitious donor, the Northern Mission Society, which, as we now know, does not exist. I straightened, understanding dawning slowly. You think Gray was facilitating not only theft but infrastructure? A network of, what, shelters? Safe houses? Possibly, Holmes said, but for whom and to what end? And We were interrupted by the arrival of a telegram delivered in the brisk hand of a boy Holmes had evidently retained for swift errands. He opened it with care, and as his eyes scanned the contents, his expression shifted, not with surprise, but grim confirmation. "It's as I suspected," he said. "I had Mycroft verify travel logs and railway records under restricted diocese access. Reverend Amos Pritchard, the false identity, boarded a northbound train the morning after Gray's death. Destination, Durham." Durham? But what's there? Holmes strode to the bookcase and retrieved a dusty register of church appointments. Durham is the seat of one of the oldest bishoprics in England and, more importantly, home to an independent theological seminary, small, discreet, and exempt from many of the central church's oversight mechanisms, a convenient place for a certain kind of man to hide among scripture and scholars. I followed his gaze across the page. There, tucked between listings, was the name Sebastian Mallory, Provost of St. Jude's Seminary, Durham. "Mallory?" I asked. Holmes nodded slowly. "He appears in Gray's private correspondence only once, and then obliquely in a note urging continued discretion on matters relating to our northern colleagues. Do you believe this Mallory is the man behind Gray?" "If he is not the architect," Holmes said, "then he is at least its master mason, the man who laid the foundation and sent Gray to build the walls." By afternoon, we were on the northbound train to Durham, rattling through the countryside beneath bruised skies. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet, save for a brief explanation that he had telegraphed Lestrade to keep Crowthorne in isolation, and the Ellicott letter secured until further notice. He did not want word of our inquiry reaching northern ears too quickly. We arrived at dusk. The ancient city loomed ahead, its cathedral spires silhouetted against the cloud-streaked sky. St. Jude's Seminary stood on the edge of the town, a severe stone structure clinging to the hill like a brooding sentinel. A porter met us at the gate, clearly unaccustomed to unannounced visitors, but Holmes offered a fabricated letter of inquiry from the London diocese, and within moments we were ushered into the provost's study. Sebastian Mallory rose to greet us. He was tall, dignified, his face lined with age, but his eyes sharp behind his wire-rimmed spectacles. He wore the plain robes of the seminary, and his office was austere to the point of monasticism. No personal effects, only ledgers, theological volumes, and an oil portrait of St. Paul rebuking Simon Magus. "Gentlemen," he said in a soft, measured voice, "to what do I owe the honour?" Holmes offered a faint smile. "We are investigating a financial irregularity tied to the Northern Mission Society. It seems several institutions tied to that name have received questionable funds routed through St. Ethelric's in Westminster." Mallory did not blink. "I've heard the name, yes. An independent fund, I was told. Not directly under the Church's arm, but said to provide aid to smaller missions." "Founded by whom?" "I couldn't say. Their correspondence came irregularly. We received a grant 2 years ago for the restoration of our library roof." "Correspondence from whom exactly?" Holmes asked, stepping closer. Mallory gestured to a filing cabinet and withdrew a folder. "Type letters, no signature. Only an address, until recently, a P.O. box in Westminster." Holmes took one of the letters and studied it. The same stationery used by Gray, but this... He turned the page to the back, then sniffed it. "Lavender oil, faint. A flourish not belonging to Gray." Mallory's brow furrowed. "What are you implying, Mr. Holmes?" "I am suggesting," Holmes said, his voice low, "that someone embedded in the clergy has used the facade of piety to establish a covert network, one funded by fraudulent donations and intended for private gatherings under the guise of charity." St. Ethelrick's was one of several staging grounds. Reverend Grey was a pawn. You, Provost Mallory, are no pawn, but the question remains, are you bishop or bishop's man? Mallory's eyes narrowed. Careful, Mr. Holmes. I am always careful, Holmes replied, especially when the fire that consumed a chapel in Westminster was designed not to destroy only a building, but to cauterize a trail that led here. The room was silent for a long beat. Then Mallory smiled coldly. If what you say is true, then you've come to the wrong place. St. Jude's is a seminary. Our purpose is theological. If others used our name to shelter something darker, I regret that deeply. But I cannot control what lies beyond these walls. Holmes studied him for a moment, then nodded. Then perhaps you won't mind if I speak with a few of your junior clergy, particularly those recently transferred from London? Mallory hesitated. It was the first misstep we had seen. I'll arrange it, he said quietly. But Holmes's eyes were already gleaming. As we stepped outside into the damp night air, I turned to him. Do you believe him? No, Holmes replied flatly. But I believe he wants to believe himself insulated. That is the mark of a man afraid, not of the law, but of his own reflection. He paused. Tomorrow, Watson, we return. I intend to speak to those students. If Mallory's hands are clean, they've been kept clean by another man's labour. And if they're not? Holmes glanced up at the stone facade, the light flickering behind the provost's window. Then we'll find the stain that fire couldn't reach. The morning broke damp and cold over Durham, the stones of the seminary slick with mist, and the air thick with the solemn hush particular to cloistered institutions. Holmes and I returned to St. Jude's early, long before lectures began, and were met at the gates by a young curate who had evidently been dispatched by Provost Mallory. The boy, no older than 20, had an earnest, almost anxious look about him, and Holmes greeted him with a warmth that seemed to put the lad instantly at ease. You'll be speaking with the others in the refectory, the curate said, guiding us through narrow stone corridors. 3 of them came from London in the past year, Brother Hewell, Brother Nash, and Brother Langford. And yourself? Holmes asked casually. I've been here since last Michaelmas, the boy replied. I was transferred from the parish school in Bow, but I never set foot in St. Ethelrick's. Holmes nodded, filing the remark without comment. The refectory was quiet, save for the soft clatter of cutlery and the occasional rustle of a page from some devotional text. A few young men sat scattered across the long wooden tables, heads bowed, some murmuring prayers before breakfast. 3 of them, soberly dressed, clean-shaven, and visibly tense, stood as we entered. Thank you for seeing us, Holmes said with his customary economy of tone. This is not an interrogation, merely an inquiry into recent events connected to St. Ethelrick's and the Northern Mission Society. At the mention of the latter, Brother Nash, a pale man with nervous eyes, shifted in his seat. Holmes noticed instantly. You knew Grey? He asked him directly. Nash hesitated, then nodded. He visited us once, at night. Spoke to Mallory in the upper library. We weren't told why. Were you aware that he died under suspicious circumstances? The 3 exchanged glances. It was Brother Langford, a tall, sharp-featured man, who spoke next. I heard. We were told it was suicide. Holmes leaned against the table. And did you know Matthew Ellicott? Brother Hewell, who had thus far remained silent, looked down at his hands. Yes, we studied together briefly, before I left London. Did he confide in you before his death? Hewell looked up, and there was something guarded, perhaps even guilt-ridden, in his expression. Only once, in a letter. He said, Something strange was happening at the chapel, people visiting late at night, books going missing from the sacristy. He mentioned overhearing a conversation through a heating grate about relocating something. He didn't say what. Holmes straightened. Did he mention Gray by name? No, but he mentioned a voice that didn't belong to the parish. He said it reminded him of a speaker he once heard at a theological forum, something about a certain accent, the tone, the phrasing. It frightened him. Holmes turned to Nash again. And what of the Northern Mission Society? Did you ever see correspondence? Nash nodded reluctantly. It was passed through our hands sometimes. Forms, grant requests, coded instructions, always typed, no names. But there were markings. A seal. A sort of watermark, Nash explained. Barely visible, a single letter, stylized and dash. Dot. Holmes's expression hardened. Mallory. Brother Langford shook his head. It doesn't prove anything. M could be anything. We assumed it stood for mission. Perhaps, Holmes said, turning away. Or perhaps it was a vanity, the initial of a man who believed himself unassailable. We left the refectory shortly after, the door closing behind us with a dull thud that seemed to echo down the hallway like a verdict. Holmes said nothing until we were well beyond earshot. Then he stopped, gazing up at a stained glass window showing St. Jude holding a builder's square. Ellicott knew, he said at last. He may not have understood all of it, but he saw enough. The books going missing, the late-night visits, the false society funding these places. Someone was moving objects, hiding something, possibly even people. Smuggling, I ventured. Or shelter, Holmes murmured. Illicit meetings, information exchange. Not for crime in the street sense, but something cloaked in righteousness. Secret societies, forbidden orders, perhaps even political dissent masquerading as theology. He turned abruptly. We must see Mallory again. Back in the provost's study, Mallory received us with the same calm demeanour, but there was a tension now behind the pleasantries, a tautness Holmes seized upon immediately. "We've spoken with your curates," Holmes said without preamble. "They were helpful. You may be pleased to know their loyalty to the seminary remains intact." Mallory gave a small, humourless smile. "I trust their discretion, but I'm curious, Mr. Holmes, what do you expect to find here? I run a school, not a syndicate." Holmes moved to the window, where the morning light cast long shadows across the floor. "Do you know," he said softly, "that one of your young men received a letter warning him of your connections? The same typeface as the Northern Mission letters, same phrasing, same watermark. Someone here, Mallory, has access to a press, one used for more than announcements." Mallory said nothing. "Gray burned a chapel to hide evidence," Holmes continued, "but it was not the first building to hide something. The Northern Mission Society operated out of multiple properties, some in London, others near here. Each carefully chosen for its ambiguity. Each with doors that locked from the outside and cellars that were bricked and unbricked within the span of weeks. Now Mallory's eyes met Holmes's, cold, resigned. "You don't understand," he said at last. Holmes stepped forward. "Then help me." There was a long pause. Finally, Mallory opened a drawer and removed a flat, black-bound ledger. He passed it to Holmes without ceremony. "It is all here," he said. "Not names, those were never written, but dates, transfers, codified references." I never asked what it was for. I only knew that Gray managed the southern branch. I handled the north. Holmes opened the ledger and turned a few pages, his eyes skimming rapidly. "Refugees?" he asked, pausing at a symbol. Mallory inclined his head. "From the continent. Fleeing persecution. Scholars. Dissenters. We were told it was temporary. Necessary for the greater good." And the money came through lay benefactors, and others, not always cleanly. Holmes closed the book, slowly, and when Ellicott learned the chapel was being used as a passageway, when he overheard the movement of crates, the strange visitors, Mallory's voice was thin. He was loyal, he asked questions, but Gray panicked. He always feared exposure. I told him to wait, to calm the situation, but he didn't. So you knew he was planning the fire. Mallory's silence was answer enough. Holmes exhaled. This ledger will go to Lestrade. I assumed as much, Mallory said, almost with relief. Outside, the wind had risen, tugging at the leaves in the cloister garden. Holmes stood for a long while at the seminary gate, staring down the hill at the city below, its spires and smoke blending into one uncertain silhouette. There are layers to every truth, Watson, he said finally. And the hardest ones to uncover are not those buried in crime, but those cloaked in justification. Good intentions make excellent disguises for dark acts. He turned, the ledger tucked beneath his arm. Come, the truth belongs to London now. We returned to London under the same steel-grey skies that had greeted us in Durham, though the city seemed heavier now, more subdued, whether from the burden of smoke still curling in memory from the ruined chapel, or from the weight of secrets that had begun, at last, to shed their veils. Holmes said little on the journey south, but I could see the storm gathering behind his calm facade. He had what he needed, the ledger, the names masked in symbols, the silent admission from Mallory. And yet I knew him too well to mistake closure for satisfaction. It was late afternoon by the time we stepped once more into Baker Street. Holmes moved immediately to the hearth, tossing aside his gloves and coat, then removed the ledger from within his satchel and placed it on the table as one might lay out a surgical tool. He opened it without ceremony. I have seen ledgers that documented theft, he said, his tone quiet and precise, but rarely one that documented something so thoroughly enshrouded in the illusion of virtue. I sat across from him, weary from travel yet compelled to see it through. He turned the pages with care, as if the ink might yet bleed out some final confession. Between the notations, dates, locations, and payments, Holmes pointed out the symbols: a crescent drawn inside a triangle, a cross bisecting a blank square, a bell circled thrice in ink. They are markers, he murmured. Each symbol corresponds to a classification. Some represent routes, safe houses used to move people. Others mark deliveries, likely crates of illicit papers or smuggled texts. And some, this bell here, marks sites of deliberate destruction, such as St. Ethelric's. Precisely. That was not merely a burning to conceal theft. It was part of a larger purge. But why? I asked. If these men believed they were aiding refugees, helping the persecuted, then why destroy the records? Why kill Ellicott? Holmes closed the ledger and leaned back in his chair. Because, Watson, something else moved alongside the charity. Gray and Mallory may have started with righteous motives, using ecclesiastical ambiguity to ferry dissidents or hide unapproved gatherings. But someone else saw opportunity, and once Ellicott stumbled upon that contradiction, once he became a threat to both the charity and the secret it concealed, he had to be silenced. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. "From Lestrade, sir," she said, setting it down. Holmes tore it open and scanned the message, then passed it to me. Crowthorne tried to poison himself in cell, survived. Claims he was ordered to destroy additional records. Says woman with red scarf delivered final instructions. Claims her name was Sister Evelyn, looking into convent registries. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Sister Evelyn? He repeated softly. She was mentioned once in Mallory's annotations. No title, no surname. only a symbol beside her name, the crescent within the triangle. Refugee? Holmes shook his head. Number handler? He rose and paced the room. Watson, there are rare moments when a case takes on the tone of a fable, a moral caution disguised as mystery. This is one of them. A woman without a surname, a series of chapels hollowed out from within, a network that began in kindness and ended in blood. He stopped by the window, staring out at the fog that rolled in over Baker Street. "Come," he said, "we are not done yet." Within the hour, we found ourselves standing before the convent of St. Hilda, the Peacemaker, in Hampstead, one of the few orders with discretionary privileges granted by both the Anglican Church and civil authority, owing to their history of sheltering war orphans during the riots of '78. The gatekeeper, a stern woman of indeterminate age, denied us at first. But Holmes presented a sealed order, a forged directive from a bishop whose signature he had astonishingly memorized years ago during an unrelated forgery case. The nun stepped aside with only the faintest hesitation. We were brought to the chapel parlour, where a younger sister soon joined us, slight, grey-eyed, her hands worn, and her face calm. She introduced herself only as Sister Maria. "We seek a Sister Evelyn," Holmes said directly. "She is not listed in the Order's public rolls, but her name has surfaced in the records of a now dismantled operation involving St. Ethelric's and the Northern Mission Society." Sister Maria hesitated. "There is no Sister Evelyn here now," she said. "But she was with us once. She departed nearly a year ago for what she called an urgent work. She said it concerned displaced women, those who had lost their homes in the East." "And did she ever return?" "No," the sister said, "though she wrote twice. The second letter was brief. She said she had found purpose in silence, that she had gone beyond the convent's calling." Holmes looked at her carefully. "Would you recognize her if you saw her again?" Sister Maria nodded. Holmes withdrew a photograph from his pocket, one he had earlier obtained from Lestrade's archive, showing a blurry figure captured in a grainy image outside St. Ethelric's. The nun studied it. "Yes," she said at last. "That is she. Her hair was shorter then, but the face, yes. That is Sister Evelyn." "Do you know her real name?" The sister shook her head. "She never gave it. She said names belong to the world." Holmes turned away, satisfied, and I could see that distant look returning to his eyes, the mind working, not from what was seen, but from what must be true. Outside, the air had turned colder. Holmes lit his pipe as we walked back toward the carriage road, and we said little until the seminary bell in the distance told the hour. "She is the last thread," Holmes said, "the bridge between Gray and whoever orchestrated the broader scheme. She was trusted by both Mallory and the curates, and she vanished precisely when the chapel scheme began to unravel." "You think she's still in London?" "She never left," Holmes replied. "A woman who vanishes without record either flees or hides in plain sight. I believe Sister Evelyn did the latter, and I believe she intends to continue the work in another form." As we reached the carriage and prepared to return to Baker Street, Holmes paused once more, watching the shadows gather across the street lamps. "When fire fails to erase truth," he said, "the faithful try silence. But silence, Watson, is the one disguise that truth will never wear for long." I said nothing, for I knew we were nearing the final chapter. And the woman with the red scarf, the ghost behind every motive, was no longer just a name. She was waiting, somewhere in the city that had buried one truth in ash, and now stood ready to bury another in prayer. The following evening was unusually quiet for London. A fog rolled in low and thick, muffling wheels, feet, and breath. Holmes sat in our sitting room with the fire burning low and his hands steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed on nothing but the fading glow of the coals. The ledger from Mallory lay open beside him, alongside a map now dotted with 3 new red pins, sites that had, until this week, gone unnoticed by any official hand. St. Ethelric's was but the most visible of many. He spoke without looking up. "She'll be at St. Dymphna's. It's no longer active as a parish church, but the crypt remains accessible by side entrance. The church was deconsecrated 5 years ago and leased quietly by a charitable trust. The same trust, I discovered, once listed Gray as a financial advisor." I glanced at the clock. "And when?" "Tonight," Holmes said simply. "She'll assume the city has lost interest, but she's not one to wait for permission. She's the architect now." We arrived just past 10. St. Dymphna's loomed at the edge of the docks, its once proud spire now a jagged silhouette against the fog. The gates had rusted open long ago. We moved silently past gravestones weathered into anonymity and descended the steps toward the crypt, our lanterns casting weak cones of light. There was sound, quiet voices, and then silence. Holmes motioned for me to stop. He moved ahead, steps precise as clockwork. I followed just behind. In the heart of the crypt, beneath ancient stone arches, stood 3 figures. One was Sister Evelyn. The red scarf was tied loosely over her head, and in her hands she held a small black book. The other 2, a man and woman, stood beside a crate bearing foreign stamps, half pried open to reveal printed pamphlets, bound materials, and what looked to be forged identification documents. Sister Evelyn turned slowly at our approach. There was no alarm in her face, only resignation. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I thought you might come." Holmes regarded her a long moment. "You left quite a trail." "I left a fire," she said softly. "Gray was supposed to destroy the chapel. He was not supposed to kill." "And yet you continued the work." She nodded. "Because it was not mine alone. We were not criminals. We were protectors. The church had turned its back on the people we helped, refugees, thinkers, those branded seditious for having the wrong name or the wrong silence. Ellicott was good, but he was going to ruin everything because he feared what he could not understand." "You could have come to me," Holmes said. "You could have brought the truth." "And what would you have done?" she asked, voice calm. "Brought it to the yard? To Parliament? The truth we lived wouldn't have lasted a day in their hands." I stepped forward. "You smuggled people, used the chapel network as a covert route." She nodded once. "And the phosphorus?" Holmes asked. "The sealed vial Ellicott found? That was no accident." For the first time, her composure cracked. "That was mine, but not for murder. It was insurance. If Gray betrayed us, if anyone tried to destroy the chapel and expose us, I would have lit the flame myself. Ellicott found it before I could retrieve it, and then Gray acted without my knowledge. I warned him not to panic. Instead, he murdered a man and forced your hand." She looked away. Holmes's voice softened. "You chose silence, Evelyn, but even silence becomes a kind of scream." There was a pause. Then she turned to the 2 others and gave them a slight nod. They stepped away from the crate, surrendering without protest. "You've already told Lestrade where we'd be," she said. "I assume he's on his way." Holmes inclined his head. "I trust Scotland Yard more than I used to, and I trust they'll see the difference between a smuggler and a killer." Evelyn stepped forward and handed him the book she carried. "Everything is in there," she said. "Names, routes, funds. We never asked for thanks, but perhaps now we won't be mistaken for ghosts." Holmes accepted the book with reverence, then stepped aside as the sound of approaching footsteps and the click of handcuffs broke the heavy silence. Later, as we walked back through the night air, the fog thinning now above the Thames, I said, "You pitied her." Holmes did not answer immediately. At last he said, "I understood her. She broke the law." "She broke many things," Holmes murmured, "but not without reason." The case of the burning chapel closed not with triumph, but with clarity. Lestrade confirmed the arrests. The press never learned the full truth, only that a rogue network had been dismantled, its ends tangled between idealism and error. Mallory remained at the seminary under quiet suspension. The ledger was filed away, sealed but not forgotten. And Holmes? He returned to the violin. That night, as the last of the fog gave way to moonlight, he played a slow minor tune by the fire. "Do you believe," I asked quietly, "that Ellicott died in vain?" Holmes paused only briefly. "No," he said. "He died trying to illuminate a darkness others had learned to walk through." He turned to the hearth where the flame flickered low and added softly, "And sometimes that's the only kind of light there is."